Welcome, good evening, and thank you so much for being here. Today is indeed a special night. This is not simply another lecture at Ave Maria University. This is a beginning, and we are gathered for the inaugural lecture of Dr. George and Catherine Szczerbaniuk lecture series, and that calls for a moment of gratitude. So we're especially grateful for Dr. George and Catherine Szczerbaniuk who are with us here today. Because this series bears their name and it also reflects their vision. The vision is that of generosity that made this hearing possible. And the series is built around a simple but a very powerful conviction that Ukraine's history, music, culture deserves to be known and indeed celebrated. Through this series, we hope that we will continue to put Ave Maria on the map of a Catholic intellectual tradition and bring here on campus world-class scholars, authors, and religious figures, cultural experts, that bring both the Catholic intellectual life and the variety of international experiences together with a particular focus on Ukraine. Each lecture is open to public and provides opportunities for engagement with our speaker, so you will be warmly welcome to a light reception outside of this hall, but also welcome to grab food and socialize inside as you continue your conversation. And tonight's lecture in particular begins at the heart of Ukrainian identity, its faith. Tonight's lecture is entitled The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, A History of Struggle and Perseverance, because Ukrainian Catholic Church history is one of those great stories of faith under fire in the modern world, as well as in many previous periods of its history, where it actually emerged with its own identity, its liturgy, and its witness not only intact, but actually renewed through struggles and persecutions. To understand this church is to understand something essential about the soul of Ukraine itself. The insistence on holding together, on one hand, Eastern tradition, but also communion with Rome, and preserving that distinct identities that even empires tried to erase and failed. And so today, we have a distinct honor of welcoming our keynote speaker. He is very Reverend Dr. Morozowich. And I have spent many blessed hours today and yesterday with my previous history of getting to know Father as a parishioner in the church where he served liturgies and helped to shepherd our flock in Washington, D.C. I don't need to dwell on his biography. It's included in your today's program. But I'll only add that Father Morozowich is not only a preeminent scholar of Eastern Christian liturgy known around the world, he's also a priest of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and he's formed in that tradition from childhood. So he brings both the heart of a pastor and the rigor of a scholar to this series. So there's no one better that I could imagine to open this series. We're so grateful to have him tonight. We will have him speak for about 35-40 minutes. Father has so much depth of knowledge that I'm sure we can linger for many hours, but we want to also save time for your questions, and we'll continue afterwards at 6:30 with the light reception, as I mentioned. So now it's my great privilege to welcome to this podium the very Reverend Mitred Archpriest, Dr. Morozowich.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lydia Zabutska, for this wonderful welcome and for inviting me to be here today on the occasion of this inaugural lecture of Dr. George and Catherine Szczerbaniuk. Thank you for making this possible. And my thank you to the leadership here at Ave Maria University. It's a great pleasure to be here I've heard so much about this wonderful university, and I even had the opportunity to meet with some students last evening, and we had a little roundtable discussion about liturgical matters, East and West. And it was great fun, and they even ate lots of pizza too. So today we're going to look at the history of this Ukrainian Catholic Church and look at what has happened through the centuries, how it came to be. And we're going to do this by way of understanding her people and really getting into the heart. And don't worry, if you want a copy of these slides, I will make them available to her, and you can click on some of these things because there'll be a lot of slides that we're going to go through. So we're going to spend just a quick first minute looking at some overview. So you see at the center of your screen here, we have the city of Kyiv, which was the center of this involvement, of this baptism that Prince Volodymyr did. It then expanded and contracted, and these are some maps that give you some of that changing history with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Russian incursions, the partitions of Poland, and finally the Austrian taking over. We have the interwar periods, the period of differing explanations for how Ukraine comes to existence. And I'd love to spend a lot of time going over that. But then the period immediately after the war, and you'll see it all the time on these maps, that green barrier gives you the picture of Ukraine and its locations. And this was up until 2014, and this just gives you a bit of the incursion areas where the war has been occurring since 2014. So when we look at this Ukrainian Catholic Church, we trace our foundations right back to the very beginning, to the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate. And this Ukrainian church came into union with Rome. As someone asked me, Father, are you Catholic? I said, yes, we've been in union since 1596. So over a 400-year history of being in union. And there's a handout with all of these dates for you to follow along and so you can reflect. But just this is where we're going to be going through in this presentation today. If I could get someone actually to hand out that handout, it's right in the back. So maybe some of you people who are supporting the wall in back can take the initiative and hand out those things. I always like to get my students involved, and I'm tempted to go to the back of room to give this lecture too, but I will refrain. So this gives you sort of an outline that you can follow throughout the lecture with some of the times and dates. So, as I've said already, we had the very beginning of this baptism of Ukraine when Prince Volodymyr chose the religion that was celebrated in Constantinople. As the Chronicles of Nestor record, that he sent his envoys, and when they went to Constantinople, they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. So beautiful was the liturgy. And so when we look at this Byzantine tradition, we see this from the very beginning, and that this entails a whole liturgical and spiritual point of view. Now, as a liturgist, which is my formal training, I can't stop but help you to think about how this religion of Christianity spreads from Jerusalem. And these three centers, and the students all got these centers properly correct yesterday when I quizzed them. I have a burning desire to quiz today, but I will let you off the hook. So Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria are the centers of which this faith in Christ that began. And if you haven't heard, there was no missal, there was no sacramentary given out at the Last Supper. It was an encounter, a dynamic encounter with a risen Lord that these people were sharing and enculturating in these different places. And so we have this pentarchy that develops then once the Mulvian Bridge incident happens, and Constantine says, in this sign I will conquer, and creates his Constantinople. So we have these as the 5 C's from which it all spreads. And this is an explanation for understanding how this all comes to be. We have the Armenian Church, which is influenced by Antioch. Then we have the West Syrian, the East Syrian, and I don't have the time to go into the multitude of richness of the Eastern traditions, But you'll see the Ukrainian is right here under the Byzantine, under Constantinople. And of course, we see our dear brothers here from the Ethiopian, Eritrean, as well as the Coptic Church based upon Alexandrinian. So we have this interrelationship of these liturgical traditions because these people were sharing the faith and living them alive, and then they grow. And through the baptism in Ukraine in 988, when Prince Volodymyr called his people to come forward, and we have the whole conversion of the nation of Rus. And that is the question that we're looking at today. And we have this, thanks to great computer modeling in our architectural world, we have a reconstruction here of the famed Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, with its entrance and its multi-domes. This beautiful cathedral has the Orantes, the Mother of God, there as the sign of protection. And you see the other icon there giving us some sense of the interior decoration and how people, when they walk into St. Sophia, they get that sense that they're walking together with saints and that they're really worshiping at the throne of God together with the whole body of Christ. So this Ukrainian church lived and grew out of that baptism, taking from it this history influenced by Constantinople. And so it was, now that we turn, and I'm going blitzkrieg through history for you, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this was the largest extent. We see Ukraine here, you see Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and part of Poland. This was the whole extent of it. It was huge. People don't really understand that when we talk about this union of Brest, which is when the bishops of this church of Kiev came into union, and there's just a note there, the union of Uzhhorod, which is in western Ukraine, did not happen until 1646, and we're loath to talk about this, but Lviv, Stanislavia, which is today Ivano-Frankivsk, and Przemysl did not come into union until 1700. So some 100 years after this big area comes into union. So what were they looking at? They were looking at preserving their identity. This copy of the Articles of Union gives you some sense of the idea of people, even with their seals, talking about this. So what did they want to do? Keep the divine worship intact. And remember, students, as we talked about yesterday, the three basic liturgies, that of John Chrysostom, Basil the Great, and the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. And this is what they wanted to have as a forever reality. And that we would not be compelled to do things that they do in the Western Church. Although I must confess to you that in my hometown, we had the wooden clappers. That's a whole other discussion about the Latinization, and I can go into lots of discussions about that. But this was the ethos of these people when they came into union. And that even ringing bells on Good Friday, because we have our own distinct tradition that is apostolic in origin, coming out of Antioch. And then, of course, going with the vestments and all of that to visit the sick, so that we could have our processions according to our holy days and our customs. So the problems were real, factions were real, but the union was bringing about a sense of revival. Now, something that you may not know is even in Poland and Lithuania, over 50% of the ruling class had been Protestant at this time. So something that I have learned is in my studies as I go deeper and start to understand this. So this was where this church comes into unity in 1596. Now remember, we're going to talk a little bit about this Russian invasion, and Russia is right there from the very beginning having its influence. There's plenty of seats up front, people, so don't hesitate to come on down. I know it's late, but come on. So one key figure that I want to bring up to you is that of St. Josaphat. If you've ever been to the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, you will find his tomb at the altar of St. Basil. St. Josaphat was one of these bishops immediately after this union of Brest. He was martyred in 1624. for trying to raise the level. Now, some of you who are students of history may know that in the, what was that, Council of Trent, right? Remember the Council of Trent, anybody? Yeah, somebody, yeah? No, from your history classes. Not that you personally remember, but from this Council of Trent in which the Catholic Church was facing the Protestant Reformation. And so one of the things that it did was to mandate a formal seminary structure. So to increase the learning, the level of theology and reflection and the depth. And so this is what Josaphat was trying to bring about, and he was really a preacher of unity. So we talked about this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We looked at this sort of at its largest extent, and this map will give us a sense of the various religious identities. And you will see this here, and this was the stronghold of the Orthodox, and this was the stronghold of the Uniate Church. So all the way north through the areas of Lithuania, Latvia, and all throughout this region is where this Uniate Church existed. And do you remember, when did LaVille come into union? 1700, and Josaphat is martyred what year? 1624. So this is even before LaVille comes into union. And so Josaphat is from up here, and we have the next slide that shows you a little bit about where his eparchy was and where he was killed and his martyrdom. So when we think about this, he was really, and I learned this firsthand when we had a series of talks in Rome at the Gregorian University, and the ambassador of Lithuania was there because they count Josaphat as his own. But that was the extent of this union. People think of the union just as something that happened in Western Ukraine, but it was throughout the country. However, through the incursions and the invasions and the partitions of Poland, Russia actively sought to thwart this. And it was at the hands of Orthodox that Josaphat was martyred. And so eventually, through the incursions and the taking over Lithuania, of Belarus, the unity of the church was shattered in those lands. The unity of the church was shattered in Kiev as it came under. And I just included some of our hymns to Josaphat and looked and to see how he was killed by enemies who loved division. And if you think about it, what's another term for the evil one? Diavolos, one who separates. So we pray to him to bring about this unity, to share this sense and this unshakable pillar of unity. And Josaphat is someone highly revered in the church today, even in Polish circles. You can find the United States, I'm sure in the Detroit area and whatnot, Latin Rite churches dedicated to St. Josaphat. So not just in the Ukrainian church, but as someone who holds this together. And so we see this religious affiliation, we see what was, and realize that, that even here, it was very prominent. So moving forward, we have the Synod of Zamość in 1720. So we're already after this, when was that year that LaVille came into union? 1700, excellent. You all have A's tonight. So, and what was happening was that these Western areas were striving to bring their practice in line, and they were then bringing upon themselves the unity, the conformity. Joseph Walimin-Rudzki, the first bishop, who was a contemporaneous with St. Josaphat, wrote many letters to Rome in which he was defending the practices of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and Rome continually said, yes, tell your neighbors to stop it. Stop the Latinizations. But by 1720, our church decided, well, we needed to try and bring our people to a place where they might be on par, where they might have some equality. And so they adopted many Latin practices, and Rome didn't approve it until 1724. And Pope Benedict XIV later in a papal encyclical wrote about that and saying there was nothing wrong with the Greek tradition. We had studied it, but we had allowed this for peace in their lands. So the Ukrainian Catholic Church continues, and this is now in Western Ukraine, with the Synod of 1891 bringing together identity, and was trying to solidify practices. If you've never heard of this wonderful man, Pope Leo XIII, in his apostolic letter Orientalium Dignitatis, was the first of the modern popes who brought attention to the Eastern churches. Now, this is something that right from the very beginning, we all remember, and I didn't have it up there, but the schism happened in 1054. The sacking of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade happened in 1204. And then finally, and unfortunately, the fall of Constantinople happens in 1453, almost immediately following after the Great Council of Union of Ferrara, Florence, from 1438 to 1439. So this was a sign of esteem that the popes had always had, but Pope Leo is bringing this forward and saying that we have to make sure that indeed all know that the Eastern Church is a wonderful church. I want to introduce you now to the person of Metropolitan Andrii Szeptycki. He was a head of an archbishop from 1901 to 1944. Interestingly, he was from Polish nobility, a Ukrainian family, and they thought upon his election that he would Polonize the church, but instead he let the tradition come to life. Now, he was fighting the bishops, and I can go into that because that's a fun discussion about what their thoughts were and what was going on. So he had to send off to Rome to have the liturgical books renewed for this practice, to get rid of the Latinizations, and he really was engaged in so many projects. This is his family. He was from a noble family. So remember that at this time we have the movements that are happening pre-World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then finally the eastern half of Ukraine is split off. And then we have from 1932 to 1933, the man-made forced famine, the Holodomor, in mostly, as you can see here, in eastern Ukraine, with Kiev being in this area. And so this is with the lands that were under Russian domination. So the people in western Ukraine, Lviv and Stanislavil, Ivano-Frankivsk today, Przemyśl, those were under the Polish Commonwealth, not Lithuania at that point, and they did not have this strong opposition that the Russians were putting on to the Ukrainians then. And why? Because they wanted to subjugate Ukraine. Over 7 million people were starved. And this all from the breadbasket of Europe. The grain was taken. They were denied what was theirs. There's a beautiful monument in Kiev that as you go in, and it just has a harrowing story of those people. So if you get a chance to travel to Kiev, even virtually, check out the monument. So Metropolitan Szeptycki continued on, and he was a veritable force. And unfortunately, he died in 1944 and then was replaced by Metropolitan Szlepej. So then in 1945, with the end of the war, we see the establishment of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialistic Republic, and so all of Lviv and these lands were brought into the Russian domination. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. In 1945, as witnessed in the CIA report of 1947, so they knew right away, in 1945, all of the bishops of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church were arrested. Metropolitan Szlepej on May 9th, 1945, And then the pseudo-synod was held in March 8th, 1946. KGB funding, delegates selected by the KGB, and the whole purpose of this was to bring about the reunion. Now, mind you, these bishops who were in prison were forced and were cajoled and tortured and said, just come, be a Russian Orthodox, because they wanted to have a valid synod, but not one single bishop broke. They witnessed to their faith. They saw that beauty that Joseph had imbued of unity with Rome, a broader concept of what it means to be church. So on March 8th, they unanimously rejected the decisions of Brest from 1596. So I don't know, do the math. How many hundreds of years? 350. So there you go. 350 years later, to the date, they held this, and then they had a liturgy then in the Sobor of St. George's where they celebrated the reunion. There was even a protester, Father Lashuk, who tried to speak up against and slow it down, but he, unfortunately, was arrested after the successful synod. So, back again, we're under the Soviet domination. Bishop Budka, Bishop Khomishin, Clemente Sheptitsky, Bishop Lakota, a priest in prison, priest in Mordva, sister servants, nuns in Siberia. And this was the liquidation and how it was brought into effect. The bishops, priests, religious, and thousands of lay people. Even one of my great uncles and aunts and their daughter was in Siberia because of their witness. Because they were speaking Ukrainian. Я не знаю, чому вони так страшили українською мовою, але, so I just said, I don't know why they hated Ukrainian language so much. I think it's a beautiful language, but the people lived. And you can talk to people who said we were part of the underground. And this is one way they went out into forests where they celebrated the liturgy. They had weddings in private, in the middle of night, in apartments, and allowing the sacraments to continue. Now, you heard of our patriarch Joseph Slapé. He was freed from prison. And there's a little clip there. You can see a little video about him as well. So, just about the time when he was freed was 1963. And just toward the end of the council, we have the decree on Oriental churches. Someone asked me yesterday, are you really Catholic? I said, yes. In fact, there are 23 Catholic churches that make up the Catholic Church, all of different origins. So what did it do? It said that these were indeed churches that were apostolic in origin. And so this is a part of the whole body of Christ and part of the living witness of tradition, and was urging them to live this more completely. And that as we see this strive for an admirable bond of unity, and this is what we need to work toward. So East and West may differ, but we united with the Pope and under his governance for those of the Catholic Eastern churches should know and be convinced that they can and should always preserve the legitimate liturgical rite, going back to what I said about the Union of Brest in 1596, what happened in 1720. So we're still in the midst of a purification of the liturgy, of a striving to live it in a sense of real beauty. And so the Eastern churches should know that. And besides, they should obtain to an even greater knowledge and a more exact use of them, and return to ancestral traditions, and even about the sacramental traditions. So there's a picture of Archbishop Slapay at the Second Vatican Council when Pope Paul VI came to bless some things that he had. And this church had a full underground structure. Metropolitan Szczerbaniuk, ordained a bishop in 1972, was the leader. And the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was the largest underground church. We have Cardinal Slapay meeting with John Paul I, and then with him with John Paul II. And a few short years later, in 1984, he passes away. And even people like Yaroslav Pelikan have issued a book to talk about how wonderful he was. So it was in 1988, the millennium of Christianity, because remember, 988 it was baptized, 1988, the millennium of Ukrainian Christianity, in which I was present and had the distinct honor of helping out in Rome when John Paul II celebrated the Ukrainian liturgy at St. Peter's altar. As a young seminarian, it was a moving experience, and one where I lived and felt and saw the unity of the church when the Pope of Rome celebrated my liturgy that I'd grown up with. What a moving time. And so after that, with Gorbachev and his movement of glasnost, the church slowly comes from the underground, and it was in the Holy Transfiguration Church in Lviv where they first commemorated John Paul II. And they came out, and Ukraine declares its independence in 1991. Again, this sense of the whole of Ukraine. And then our then leader, who replaced Slapay, Cardinal Lubachevsky, returns to Lviv on March 30th, 1991. And we have shortly thereafter Orientale Lumen of St. John Paul II, in which he praises the integral part of how the Eastern churches are a unique witness. And we have to be conscious of our bearing this tradition together with whom, as it says in the last line, our Orthodox brothers and sisters. So we talk about a sister church ecclesiology. And then Archbishop Huzar takes over, and it was then that I had the distinct honor of helping to prepare for the visit of Pope St. John Paul II to Ukraine. And I will never forget the liturgy in Kiev when he celebrated on one day the Ukrainian Greek Catholic liturgy and another day the Latin Rite liturgy. But then when we came into Lviv, there was even a special plane that Rai Television had chartered, and I was part of the press bureau for our church at that time in Rome, and even arranged a tour of journalists to come and learn about Rome from Ukraine so they could see what it was about. And I had the distinct honor and privilege of riding on the Vatican-accredited bus from the airport in Lviv in the procession of St. John Paul II to the center of the city. And I witnessed something that I didn't think I would ever see. Journalists from New York Times, AP, Reuters, CBS, you name it, New York Times, they were on this bus. You know, the creme de la creme, the ones that fly with the Pope on the plane. From the airport to the center of the city, people were gathered. 3 people deep, 4 people deep. The closer you got into the city, 20 people deep, thronged to see the Pope of Rome, where just a few decades earlier, they were living life in the underground church. The journalists were crying. They realized the moment. They were moved to see that which was dead has come to life, that the whole world is looking upon these people in Ukraine. And that's when the cornerstone for the Ukrainian Catholic University was blessed, and as well the beatification of the new martyrs. It's a sad statement that the 20th century was one of the bloodiest centuries in the history of humanity, and particularly bloody for Christianity. But we have these new martyrs, and we ask for their intercession. I'd already mentioned that this university was established, but established from the Lviv Theological Institute. And then we have Cardinal Huzar in 2005 transferring this seat from Lviv to Kiev. Where did the union take place? In 1596, in Kiev. That was the Kiev Halych Metropolia. So reminding all of Ukraine about this unity, about this sense of being together with a universal church. So then his beatitude, who had severely limited eyesight, retires in 2011, and Bishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk succeeds and becomes the head of the church in March 2011. Around that same time, we had the flourishing of the university. His beatitude visits Pope Benedict, and even a new cathedral of the resurrection is in Kiev to mark the presence of our church. Unfortunately, in 2014, the war begins in Ukraine. You can see that little yellow spot was where it began in the Donetsk region. And it was, in a sense, all because of this manifestation of the Maidan freedom fighters in 2014 that did not want to see them turn toward Russia, but so that they could live free. Remember what happened under Russian occupation? That whole Uniate church liquidated, destroyed. The remnant of it in Western Ukraine that lived in persecution and witness. So we even had a 150th anniversary celebration of Josaphat's canonization right in St. Peter's Basilica. This time with the patriarch of our church, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, celebrating 2017, even moving forward. And finally, it was the 2022 full-scale attack, now 4 years into it, and it breaks my heart to talk about this. The millions of people disposed, and non-Russian Orthodox churches being liquidated in those captive areas. Ukrainian Catholic priests being arrested and tortured in prison. Numerous Protestant churches liquidated, their pastors imprisoned. So this was in our parish in Washington, D.C., shortly after that when we had a prayer service, witnessing from people in consolation. So where does this all stem from? Well, part of it is the sense of the Ruski Mir ideology. But Putin told us in 2005 that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the destruction and collapse of the Soviet Union. We heard it. And then if you are interested in seeing more about this, you can download from this site, which is in the Russian Orthodox patriarchal site, which isn't translated into English, but you can find many ways to translate that into English. Just download it and get it translated. But for your reading comfort or discomfort as it may be, the first thing is talking about not a war, but a special military operation in this national liberation of the Russian people against the criminal Kiev regime. I don't know what they were guilty of. They weren't bombing the Russians. They certainly weren't engaged in killing Russians. So this has been going on, as it says, being waged in the lands of southwestern Rus. So Rus was this name for all of this territory. Now, we didn't have time to develop it clearly, but Moscow didn't exist at the time. It was only something that came into being after the invasion of the Mongols, and they were great trade partners, and this small city grew up. It was just a small city. And then it grows up and then begins to dictate to everyone else what this was supposed to be about. And even we have it seen as a sacred war about the spiritual place and getting rid of the West. A West, as they say, has fallen into Satanism. You and I in the West, just to be clear where we are and who they're talking about. So they see this as this whole idea of the Russian Federation and the greater historical Russia. And they talk about Little Russia being Ukraine and White Russia being Belarusia and all of this, and how that, no, but even includes, as you see that last part here, all those for whom the Russian tradition, the shrines of Russian civilization and great Russian culture are the highest value and meaning of life. To give you a little bit of an insight into this, I share with you pictures of the Russian Orthodox military cathedral, some 60 Ks north of Moscow. And you can see here some of the military apparatus around the cathedral, Patriarch Kirill blessing the cathedral, some of the decorations of it. But it's this icon, and I think you can see pretty clearly what they're holding. Can you see it? What is it? What? Weapons. When have you ever seen guns in iconography before? This is the ideology that is being purported, and you have even people here praying in front of these. This is the sense of indoctrination that has come about in Russia. So you see further pictures there. Now, in the meantime, people continue to die. Processions through the town happen, burying the dead, the witness of young soldiers carrying the cross, prayers for even wounded lay people. So I have here a picture of two priests who were freed, Father Bogdan Galeta and Father Ivan Letvitsky, arrested in 2022 and released in 2024 after the intervention of Pope Francis was influential in that. So this war includes the total annihilation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church today. And know that today our fellow Christians in Ukraine go without electricity, go without heat, and are being terrorized in their homes, not on the front, but that's where this war is going to destabilize. The latest that's happened, as my friends have told me, they're even going after police. So they have a false call. Police come out there and then they set off a bomb detonating to kill the police so that they can bring about civil unrest. I want to recommend to you a film called Children in the Fire. You can look it up online. It will become streaming soon. Roman Alexiou. I met him at the university where we had a streaming of this film, and you can see the children in the front row here. Standing to my right is the director of the film. And these children each witness. Some of them were imprisoned because they were taken away to Russia, fighting to be free. Some, like our dear friend here, Roman, was just with his mother, and one of the drones hit in civil area, and his mother was taken from him. And I'll tell you, I was moved when after this I wanted to give him a blessing, and he was just so thrilled to get this blessing. Something that the Russians would have been horrified at. A Ukrainian Greek Catholic priest giving a blessing. Now, he was Ukrainian Greek Catholic as well. But just that simple thing. And his spirit is so indomitable, he's even taking up ballroom dancing. And so you see people who have been through the fire, whose very existence has been persecuted, they're living. They're unstoppable and witnessing. One of the women pictured here is also a marathon runner, even though she has prosthetics. Indomitable. But for every one of these wonderful stories, there are numerous other people that are broken. The tolls are huge, but yet we gather together with the Pope of Rome, Pope Leo, and we pray. Just a couple of days ago, the Pope prayed this at the Sunday Angelus. So many victims, so many lives and families shattered, such immense destruction, such unspeakable suffering. Every war is truly a wound inflicted upon the entire human family. It leaves in its wake death, devastation, and a trail of pain that marks generations. Peace cannot be postponed. It is an urgent necessity that must find a home in our hearts and be translated into responsible decisions. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church will continue to witness. My friend, the head of the church, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, and I were classmates in Rome many years ago now. It's hard to imagine how long that was, because I graduated with my diploma in 2002. But he stands there in Kiev and witnesses. Our priests strive, our lay people witness. Witness to this ideal of brotherly love. Witness to this idea of a universal church. Witness to that unity with Rome. We're not afraid. Our spirit is unbreakable because there's nothing that they can touch, because it's God alone that sustains us. So thank you, and I ask you to pray for Ukraine. God bless you.
Well, thank you so much to Father Mark Morozowich. And now, of course, we have the privilege of hearing so much about Ukraine and the church that I'm sure you're burning with a lot of questions. We do have scheduled at least 10 minutes for it, but we'll continue talking, and there are light refreshments available. So please now feel free to walk up to the podium and ask a question.
There's a microphone right in the center.
Sir, not to the podium.
Thank you for the talk, Father.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. Two questions on the opposite sides of the spectrum. I know you had mentioned that the guns were in the iconography. Do you think it's always wrong to have guns in the iconography? Because I know there was in the 17th and 18th century some muskets that were displayed. Do you think it's just wrong how the Russians are displaying it in their church? And the second question, more lighthearted. How is that university doing? I know you mentioned that it was, I think 2005, that it was established. Is it still doing good? Is it?
So thank you. I guess it's a hard thing for me to talk about killing people in church. And so I find a hard justification for that. Now, of course, self-defense, and we want to understand that. So it's not about, soldiers or about people who give their life in defense of others. It's about the weapons of destruction that are there for me. So I wouldn't, I can think of, St. George with the dragon slayer, and so that's a little different in a sense of the spiritual warfare that we try to depict. But, the Lord asks us to forgive one another. And so it's a hard thing for me to see how that squares with anything that's going on, and especially if we take a look at the Eucharist and we recollect that the Son of God gave himself on the cross for the life of the world. And sometimes I wish that he would have straightened some things out afterwards. but he gave us love and mercy and forgiveness. Even his right hand, you know who I'm talking about? The one who says, I don't know him, who runs away, Peter. He forgives and brings him forward. And so God is showing us this way to more perfect love. So your second question again was more lighthearted, and just remind me.
The university.
So the university is in 2002 is when it was created as a university, continues to do well. They have their high standards for enrollment, and they have some of the highest standard test enrollment numbers, and they're continuing to adapt in the midst of the war. If any of you are around in Washington, D.C. at the end of not this month, but the end of next month, at the end of March, we're going to do a full-scale discussion about this synod, the pseudo-synod, the 80th anniversary, and looking at Ruski Mir as well. So that we'll have at least 4 of the professors from there coming to join us. And they have embarked on a whole new prosthetic program. So they're trying to meet the needs of the people at hand. So doing pretty well. More questions? Anything else?
Could you explain the Russian Orthodox Church and also the members of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia? What do they think, or what do you feel? I guess I know there's lots of emotions, but what are your ideas?
That's a great question, and I will turn to, and I forget Marie's name, but there is a French, I guess, sociologist, political scientist. I don't know if you know her from Paris, Marie, and she spoke in Washington about a year or so ago, and she did extensive visits. And she said that people are generally, dissatisfied with the way things are and the way things are going, but it's hard to understand how to make regime change. So based upon what she said, because she's been there, I've never been into Russia, I don't know. I have different conversations with people that are here, and many of them that I engage with, are very much sad about what's going on. Through our institute, we did an interview, and we did a whole series around this cathedral, and it's called The Weaponization of Prayer, and you can find it on our YouTube site, in which we have Sergei Chepnin, who is a fellow at Fordham, who is Russian Orthodox himself, was a journal editor for the Moskovsky Patriarchat, and he couldn't see what this was about and was a protester, and he left Russia, and so he's one of the main people that are speaking about this. So I think that there are many, good Russians that are trying to find a way. I just wish they would do it faster, and so we could end the carnage. Yes?
Pope Leo and before him Pope Francis have decried the death and the violence in Ukraine and called for peace, but I never heard either one of them denounce Putin's Russian invasion. It's like, are they scared to address Putin? It's like they almost make it sound like it's a barroom brawl, or India and Pakistan arguing about who owns what part of Kashmir. I would hope that the leader of the Catholic Church would be willing to call a spade and not simply ask for peace.
I am in complete agreement with you. And I am not going to defend what hasn't been said. I can give a little explanation and say that the Vatican diplomacy tries to open up channels of discussion and wants to do all of that. But, the Patriarch of Constantinople has already said publicly that this idea of Ruski Mir is not plausible. And not only that, since the 2014 invasion, or then between 2018 and finally in 2019, the Patriarch of Constantinople recognizes an independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And then this brought about the split between the Patriarch of Moscow and Constantinople. So I'm in complete agreement with you, and I wish that it would be as clear as you put it, call a spade, and
Yeah, because what I've heard in the past is that, perhaps the Pope has felt that by not speaking more firmly, maybe there'll be a union between the Catholics and the Orthodox in the future, and I just don't see that happening.
so we could have a discussion about the Ostpolitik of the Vatican and what has been its stance and where they're trying to move. And that's a whole other discussion and talk, but happy to engage in that. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Father Morozowich, for the lecture. I have a question on the future of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. A week ago, I've read that there was a new commission for the Eastern churches. I was wondering, how is that reflective on the Catholic part, because Catholic universal, but not uniformal. I was trying to understand that it's a fine line to cross, and this new commission, is it reflective of Leo's namesake, Leo XIII, with his Orientalium Dignatis? Are we following the same path for the Ukrainian church?
So the commission that I think you're speaking about is the Commission on Canon Law that was just created. And the Code of Canon Law was published around 1991 for the Eastern churches. It's called the CCEO for those of you who are in the business. And the Latin code is the CIC, and I think the CIC was published about 1983. So it's normal to go through some updates. In addition to the CCEO for the Eastern churches, each Eastern church sui juris, according to its own laws, is invited then to adapt and put these things forward. So our synods have been working and have their own law called the particular law of the church that has come forward. And of course, it's approbated in Rome. So I think it's important to look at the codex and to adjust it from time to time. So I think that's a very normal aspect of that. We have our bishops involved in various different dicasteries in Rome. And one of our newly ordained priests for the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was just ordained by Patriarch Szewczuk in Rome at our Church of Hagia Sophia, St. Sophia. A good friend of mine, Daniel Galazza, born in Chicago, raised in Canada, and he is a liturgist as well, so I know Daniel very well. And he was working for many years as a deacon, teaching in Kiev, and then is teaching at the Pontifical Oriental Institute. So he's as well working on the liturgical desk at the Oriental Dicastery today. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done. I'm a big proponent, and I try to impress upon my fellow Ukrainian Greek Catholic priests the importance of academic life. And you'd be surprised how many people don't want to enter the academic life. And I think that it's a great life. It's an important life. And the more that we can be involved at the highest levels of academia can as well help to shape the focus and the movement of the Catholic Church as a whole.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Hello, Father. Thank
Hello.
you for that wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
My question is, how has the Greek Ukrainian Church become involved in the political culture of Ukraine, or rather in the affairs of the surrounding countries?
So I think that one of the best ways to look at this, and something that I did not address in the talk, is that there's a council of churches in Ukraine. Not just churches, but religious organizations, because a church by definition, so this is where my theology comes in as well, is church comes from the Greek, from the German Kirche, and so that's how we get this word. But really, church in that language that the Bible was written in, Greek, is ekklesia, ekkaleo, so those called out. So ekklesia are those called out. So not only are there churches which are by definition Christian, there are the Crimean Tatars, there are the Jews of Ukraine. So Ukraine is a multi-religious entity. And so it is through this body that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, together with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Metropolitan Epiphany, recognized by Constantinople, and even the Moscow Orthodox Patriarchate participates in this council as well. So they all gather together and they try to talk about what it is to be a free country and what it is to live and be able to express and engage with one another. So that's how predominantly the church is engaged. It's an important thing to think about how we are speaking in the public sphere for the protection of the faithful. And that's something that we're involved in. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church today boasts representatives and bishops in almost all the continents. So we have people in Brazil, in Argentina. We have our church throughout Western Europe that's growing. So each of these in its own way striving to bring the people to Christ in their own realities. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Father.
Any other questions, or is it time for refreshments? Oh, one more question. Absolutely. I could go on like this forever. I get energized by this.
Я не збиралася говорити, але ця доповідь, виступ, це помпезно. Я українка зі Львова. І не просто українка зі Львова, а я вже старша людина, яка багато чого з того, що ви нам розказували, я це пережила. Парафіянка собору Святого Юра у Львові. Коли наступили часи 72-й рік, вільніше стало, і сестри, я забула, сестра ця померла, яка їздила в Сибір. Сестра з собору Святого Юра, Стефанія, я забула ім'я, їздила в Сибір шукати могили сестер, які були заслані. І нам потім приїхала і розповідала, як над ними знущалися. Я пам'ятаю, як я студенткою була на практиці в Карпатах, і ми зайшли в церкву, і там була Біблія, а ми, філологи, хотіли прочитати.
One of the memories that this presentation evoked in me was the time when, at the rise of the Catholic Church from underground, I recall when a religious sister, Stefania, made a trip to Siberia to find the graves of those from her order that were murdered and died, and tortured and died in Siberia. And she told us all the horrific stories of their suffering. I also remember as a younger student in the 70s
І нас могли виключити, як вони казали, з університету, але Бог милував за цей факт, бо викладач не сказав про це в деканаті.
That even going to a church on a student trip and looking at the Bible, and we were Ukrainian language students of Ukrainian language and literature. We wanted to see the text of the Bible in the church, and we tried to access that. But thankfully, our professor didn't tell on us, and we could, because those were the types of acts that you could be even persecuted for.
Я також пам'ятаю, як в 79-му році нам треба було хрестити сина свого Юрія у Львові. І що? А я вчителька. І я знала, що так може статися, що я лишусь без роботи. І ми домовилися, що на такій вулиці Алілюхіна, не знаю, де той священик, вже тепер помер, звичайно, але чи там збереглася його родина, він вдома хрестив мого сина. В 80-му році мені треба було хрестити свою дочку Лідію. Ви розумієте, так? Прошу перекласти.
Ви закінчите скоро, так?
Може я нудна, якщо я...
So in 1979, I had to baptize my son, and the way it was done, I had to find a priest who was in hiding and bring him to the priest's apartment and just have the baptism done there in secret. In 1980s, I had to also baptize my daughter in secret because if it was in public, I could lose my job.
And she is the daughter that she's
І
talking
я так
about.
хотіла побачити вже в церкві, домовились, що я не піду до церкви. Але я ж хотіла бачити, як будуть хрестити мою дочку. І так вдалині в церкві стою, а священник не побоявся і каже, а мама тут є? І я підійшла. І ви розумієте, я йому вдячна, що він не боявся. Бо це все одно, все фіксувалося. Були люди, які могли шпигувати за таким.
And so when baptism of my daughter took place, I decided to go and stand at the back of the church so as not to be identified. But the father, the priest who was doing the baptism, was rather brave, and he called out. He said, "Is the mother here?" And he called me out forward.
Я ще пам'ятаю, як ви згадували покійного Володимира Szczerbaniuka. Між іншим, в соборі Святого Юра ми часто ходимо в крипту, там вони лежать, ну, не скажу поховані, в крипті вони знаходяться. Володимир Szczerbaniuk і інші видатні люди, єпископи. І Володимир Szczerbaniuk, це був 70, ну, якийсь другий, напевно, рік, але акції піонерів. Ми мусили привезти дітей на палац піонерів на іншу зовсім якусь виставу. А він зайшов і мав дуже багато хрестиків і почав хрестики роздавати дітям. Це я це пам'ятаю, навіть в мене є така фотографія, як він ті хрестики роздає. Отакий ще факт. Ну і ще один факт зараз Ліда скаже. Ви про Івана Павла II. Ви не уявляєте, як він приїхав у Львів. Весь Львів тиждень, у нас було свято, цілий тиждень. Він на Сихові казав, дощ іде по-польськи, діти роснув. Всі його любили, всі до нього гарно віталися, він з людьми. Весь Львів. Тому ми такі патріотичні, тому що ми віримо в Бога і ми зустрічаємо тих людей, які до нас прийшли з Богом. І а ворогів ми ненавидимо. А як почалася війна, то я казала, я би сама пішла до того москаля, хоч вже не маю сили. Я вам дуже вдячна, Отче. Це щось надзвичайне. Я не все, напевно, розуміла, але я все бачила, все читала і згадувала дуже багато. Не буду вже вам так багато вашого часу займати, але це було щось надзвичайне. Люди, це щось... Вам треба ще і до нас до Львова приїхати українською мовою, це нам показати в соборі Святого Юра.
З радістю.
Переклади. Дякую.
Just to briefly summarize, another highlight was His Excellency Bishop Szczerbaniuk, and memory is how deeply engaged he was with the youth, and even in time the Soviet regime had these houses of pioneers for young communists. He would come there and he would distribute miraculous medal. I even have a picture of him just reaching out to the youth at that time, at the crack of 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And then, I think I'm forgetting another story.
And a visit.
St. John Paul the Great, the second the Great, to Ukraine, specifically to Lviv, was an occasion of great joy and celebration that lasted for an entire week. And this was a sign of truly the unity and celebration of the Catholic faith and Ukraine. And he was, for instance, in his meeting with the youth in the part of Lviv that is called Sikhiv, thousands of young people gathered together. It started to rain, and he would sing a song in Polish to them, saying that the rain is falling down and the children are growing. So a lot of beautiful highlights from the church. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here.
And I remember that occasion in Sikula. I was there as well. And it was just electric to watch him sing with the crowd. And he would just like start a song, and then everyone would just join in. And it was just emotional that a Slav was there with other Slavs witnessing the freedom. So thank you very much. I think we have some things over there, so we'll continue the discussion. God bless you.